Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name is ReapeeRon, and today we're going to be doing another Killing Floor 2 tier list. This is going to be on the Sharpshooter weapons, because last time I did the Sharpshooter weapons I did not include the Beluga Beat, and here's an updated list of all the Sharpshooter weapons. So let's begin with the starting stuff, which we have all the starting equipment, and then we'll be talking about each of them as we go by the tiers. So first up we got the Winchester. The Winchester is our starting weapon. It does very high damage, it has nice long range, it reloads fairly fast, at least per bullet. You can reload this faster than a lot of weapons, assuming you only need to reload 1 or 2 shots. But with upgrades, it scales really well, and it comes in at a very nice weight of 4. I would put the Winchester all the way up into A tier, because I still use the Winchester quite a lot throughout the whole match, and it's probably one of the best starting weapons just in the game in general. Next we have the Cookery. This is the knife for Sharpshooter. You're never going to use this unless you're completely out of everything, because you don't want to get close to enemies with Sharpshooter. You have no additional tankiness, you have no mobility, you have no increased damage with melee weapons. So this is a last ditch weapon, or if you need to pull it out to block or something, even though it is probably the coolest looking, or one of the coolest looking knives in the game. So D tier you go. Next we have the Cryo Grenade. The Cryo Grenade is probably one of the most useful grenades in the game. I'd put it right behind the medic grenades. This allows you to freeze enemies, and it's all around just a really solid grenade. You also can't hurt yourself too bad with it. You can still injure yourself with the Cryo Grenade, but it is more difficult to do than other grenades, and you won't get injured as bad as other grenades. So I would also put this one up into A tier. Then we've got the 9mm pistol, which is a pretty good weapon on Sharpshooter. You can get away with using dual 9mm on Sharpshooter because your bonuses are towards headshot damage, and you also get the recoil reduction. So it makes the 9mm a very nice choice early on. You can do a lot of damage with it. You can also score rack 'em up with it, which is pretty nice. I'd put the 9mm probably into C tier, because it does have a pretty decent purpose on Sharpshooter. Now moving on to some of our tier 2 weapons, or in this case tier 1 weapon, we have the 1858 Revolver. If you take one of these, it's on perk. This can make a really good pistol early on, especially if you find it on the ground. You can kill a lot of enemies with it, but it's not a weapon I really go out of my way to get with Sharpshooter. You just have better options than it in a lot of the cases. So I would probably put this one into D tier, because at least you start out with the 9mm. If you find this on the ground though, it's really good for the first couple waves, and I'd probably put it into B or C tier. But you're probably not going to throw upgrades into it, and you're probably not going to keep it. So I'm still going to keep it into D tier just for that reason. Up next, we got the Spitfire. This one can be kind of fun. You get a decent weapon that deals AoE damage, and it does okay damage, as well as it has good scaling, similar to the 1858. You can pair this with some other weapons that are rather heavy, or just as a filler spot if you want another gun. The Spitfire has some issues though, mostly with you not getting any increase in fire damage, which is not a big deal if you only want to use this for small enemies like crawlers, stalkers, clots, things like that. But against anything else, it's pretty lackluster. You again get headshot damage, so if you want to upgrade it all the way, you can, and it can do really high damage, but that's the same thing with all Sharpshooter weapons. It's probably also into D tier. I'm not sure if I'd put it above or below the 1858. Probably below it, because you're not just going to find a Spitfire laying on the ground unless you had a Firebug die or a Gunslinger die that took it. So you're more likely to find the 1858 just laying around on the ground. And it's moving on, we have the Centerfire. And the Centerfire, I'd say, is one of the best Sharpshooter weapons in the game. It's extremely lightweight at only 5. It scales incredibly well with upgrades. And if you wanted to go with more of the sniper build, which is running more damage on Sharpshooter, you don't even need to hit headshots on small enemies, or even really medium enemies with the Centerfire. It will do enough damage even without upgrades to body shot all small enemies with 1 shot, even body shot some of the medium enemies with 2 to 3 shots. It's pretty surprising how well it works. Its only real downside is that it reloads kind of slow, and you do have to reload each round individually. But if you can manage that, it is absolutely a monster. I would put this one into S tier. Up next, we have the Crossbow. The Crossbow can be pretty good. It does high damage. You essentially have infinite ammo with it if you're willing to go pick up your bolts, assuming they don't fly out on the map. You can punch through multiple enemies with this. It has arguably one of the nicest optical sights on it out of anything in the game. I don't know why other weapons don't use the crossbow sight, because it would be really nice to have on certain rifles. It is just a single shot weapon though, so you will need to reload it, and it does not scale as high as some of your other weapons do. It's still not a bad weapon by any means, and it pairs really well with something like the Centerfire or the Winchester or the M14 or even the FAL. I still have some issues with it, and I would probably put the crossbow high up into C tier, because it does still do a lot of damage, and it's really not all that difficult to run through like a whole match on Hell on Earth only using the crossbow. So it's not bad, it's just kind of managing it can be a little bit difficult. Certain maps it's not super great on. Up next we have the M14, which is a fan favorite. A lot of people like the M14 because it's not that expensive. It does high enough damage to one-shot headshot enemies, which is pretty good, or two-shot headshot enemies, which is also pretty useful. You can kill large enemies with this too, but it does take a lot of rounds. That's not too bad if you combine it with the Cryo Grenade. It scales okay with upgrades, but honestly, it's not that great. I honestly think that the M14 is still not a fantastic weapon on Sharpshooter. I think it's good. I feel like it would be much better if the M14 was on a class like Commando. Then it would be a really amazing weapon, and I would love to use it. But on Sharpshooter, I just don't really find myself taking it very often, and when I do, it doesn't feel as good as something like the Centerfire, where even if I'm not super accurate that day, the Centerfire doesn't care. I can still kill things, and I can kill large enemies faster with it than I can with the M14. I'd put the M14 into B tier. Mosin is a DLC weapon. It hits really hard with each of its shots. It is a bolt action, so it's a little bit slow, but not really for a bolt action rifle. You can shoot this thing incredibly fast. You can also reload it surprisingly fast too, and it does have a bayonet on it, which you can use to stab. The bayonet does pretty decent damage, and it has the longest reach out of any of the melee weapons in the game besides the special attack from the ion thruster. That's the only melee weapon that has longer range. You can also block and parry with the Mosin, which is a really big deal for Sharpshooter because that gives you increased tankiness. The only downside of the Mosin is really that it comes in at kind of an awkward weight. If it wasn't at 7 weight, if it was something at like 6 weight or lower, it would be arguably one of Sharpshooter's best weapons. Right now, it's still a really strong weapon, but it's not as good as some of the others. I would put this one up into A tier, probably just below the Winchester because the Winchester is more flexible than the Mosin is. Up next, we have the Beluga Beat, which is the weapon that I didn't talk about last time. So the Beluga Beat is a very interesting weapon for Sharpshooter. It comes in at another kind of awkward weight, similar to the M14 or the Mosin. It can be paired with either of those, and it works quite well with them. This does give you some usefulness towards pretty much everything because with its regular attack, it does really well against crowds, and you can bully around enemies pretty easily, like flesh pounds or even bosses. So it's more of a supportive weapon for Sharpshooter, and with its secondary fire, it acts more like a regular weapon that you'd see from Sharpshooter. By itself, I honestly don't think the Beluga Beat is all that great. It's okay if you combine it with some other weapons like the Centerfire, the Mosin, the M14. All of those work pretty well with it. If you don't want to be under the pressure of hitting headshots and killing large enemies, the Beluga Beat can help you with that. And if you're just getting into Sharpshooter, I'd probably recommend taking it. But right now, I'd probably put the Beluga Beat into C tier, just below the Crossbow. Next, we have the 500 Magnum, which is another pretty decent weapon on Sharpshooter. You can do high damage with it. It is fairly cheap because you're only going to buy one of these. If you buy 2, you don't get the bonuses from them. It only weighs 3, so you can pair it with any other weapon. It does scale well. It just doesn't scale as well as a lot of the other Sharpshooter weapons that just are incredibly good at scaling. And if you wanted a better weapon for the price, I would say the Centerfire is better than the 500 Magnum, unless it's simply that you don't have the weight to take whatever loadout you want to take with it. The 500 Magnum is probably the best sidearm weapon to take, and I would probably put this up into B tier. Because with certain loadouts, if you want to like fully upgrade the Mosin and take a 500, you can, although you could still take a Centerfire. Next, we have the Railgun. The Railgun hits incredibly hard. It's a single shot gun that weighs 9. With its upgrade, it goes up to 10. It has a lock-on mode, which is really bad. Never use the lock-on mode. There's really no reason to, because anytime you use the lock-on mode, you have your damage per shot. Even though this does come in at a hefty weight, you can still take quite a few weapons like the Centerfire, the Winchester, 500 Magnum, even the Crossbow if you wanted. I don't think I've ever tried that, but you could do it if you wanted to. I'd put the Railgun up into S tier. I don't think I'd actually put it above the Centerfire though. I think the Centerfire, because of its flexibility and its strengths, is still a little bit better than it. Next we have the FAL. The FAL is a full auto assault rifle or a semi-auto rifle that has an ACOG sight on it, which is okay in this context. It's not kind of a weird ACOG situation like it is on the FAMAS. This does decent damage per shot and can do a lot of damage per second. It doesn't really scale all that well with upgrades compared to the other Sharpshooter weapons, but it still scales all right. So the FAL is a similar position to the M14. I would say it's a little bit better than the M14. Because it is full auto, you can get more damage per second out of it, even though it is more difficult to control than the M14. And the M14 is probably better overall in a lot of ways. So if you want a general purpose weapon, I would say the M14 is better than the FAL in a general purpose setting, at least if you're counting just the full auto part of it. If you're counting semi-auto, I would say they're pretty equal. Next we have the M99 50 cal rifle. This thing weighs a ton. It weighs 12, which makes it so you can only take handguns as your secondary unless you want to go off perk, in which case you could take something like a medic handgun or a medic SMG or C4 if you really wanted to do a ton of damage. It has a slow reload. This weapon excels in a few areas where it's really good on boss wave, or it can be really good on boss wave depending on which boss you get and what kind of area you're fighting in. Outside of that though, it's pretty lackluster. It's really not going to beat the Railgun, and that's kind of sadly what you have to compare it to. They're both single shot weapons that hit really hard, but the Railgun has more options that you can take, and the Railgun hits hard enough that you don't need the extra damage a lot of the time for the M99. Again, only on boss wave have I really found it to be super useful. So I would put this one into C tier because of all the limitations that it has. It still is a super fun weapon to use, and I know a lot of people like it, but it's just so specialized that I don't think I can put it any higher than that. The compound bow can shoot frost arrows, and it recently got buffed to where you get more arrows back whenever you get ammo, and you have more arrows overall. So you get additional ammo from it, which is really nice. The freezing arrows can be really useful to actually freeze enemies. So if you wanted to go for a full supportive build as Sharpshooter, you could take the Beluga Beat and the Cryo bow, and you could do that quite well. It does have the spike on it. It's not really a bayonet, it's more of a spike on it that you can stab with. It does decent damage. You can kill small enemies that way. This is another weapon that you have essentially infinite ammo for, where you can go pick up your arrows unless they're the frost arrows, in which case they will break once you shoot them. It's kind of fun to play around with, but I would rather take the crossbow over it. So if I want something heavier hitting, I can do that. And for this price, I could buy the Railgun, or I could almost buy the 50 cal, in which case I'm also doing more damage. So I would put this one probably also toward the bottom end of C tier. I don't think it's quite D tier because it still has a decent amount of value and I still use it occasionally, but it's certainly not one of like my favorite go-to weapons with Sharpshooter. Thanks for watching this, and special thanks to all of the members of the channel. If you would like your name on here, be sure that you join the YouTube membership program that's linked down in the description below, or join the Patreon. Either way nets you a spot on this list. If you're new here and you enjoyed this video, make sure that you get subscribed. That way you get notifications whenever I post these videos. If you would like to see more of my Killing Floor tier lists and more of my Killing Floor content in general, click over here on this playlist. That'll take you to a whole list full of videos there. I hope you guys have a great day, and goodbye.